So our next speakers are going to talk about the industry approach to collecting and sharing supplier-related ESG data. Nigel Bell is a senior manager at Deloitte Consulting, and he's the lead for Deloitte's new industrial marketplace offering. Nigel has extensive experience in oil and gas and has been focused on transforming how organizations collaborate with members of their broader ecosystem to eliminate waste, increase efficiency, and optimize margins. A key part of Nigel's focus has been on helping organizations to operationalize their ESG objectives through innovative approaches to ESG data management, supplier enablement, and stakeholder engagement. Prior to working in oil and gas, Nigel flew for the Air Force and NATO for 9 years. Thank you for your service. With a variety of domestic and international assignments. Nigel holds an MBA and MS in Global Supply Chain Management from Kelley School of Business at Indiana University and a BS from Georgetown University. Keith Fortson, he's the global head of ESG at Riskonnect, Inc., and vice president of strategy and innovation as well. He has a background in natural resource management, public policy, and macroeconomics from Texas A&M University. Do I get a whoop? I knew there had to be one in here. I knew there had to be at least one. And has spent the last 20 plus years helping organizations navigate the intersection of political, economic, social, and environmental. Is that even possible? Man, that sounds difficult to me. Intersection of political, economic, social, and environmental landscapes to align programs and initiatives. Prior to joining Riskonnect, Keith was Chief Customer Officer at ICIX and led platform and analytics for multiple industries at Salesforce. Could you welcome our speakers? Read that.
Okay, so just getting familiarized. So Mike is on here, and then I think you're indicating mics are on the chairs as well, in case I want to walk around. Is that a head nod? Is that right? Okay. All right. So good morning. So my name is Nigel Bell. Thank you very much for a very nice introduction. Today we're here to talk about kind of a different topic, and some of you have kind of stopped by our booth in the back that's just right outside those doors, and talked about the challenge that's now sitting on all of your shoulders because of this kind of shifting and increasing ESG landscape that's out there, right? There's a lot of pressure on your organizations to kind of navigate through this, and right now that pressure is sitting squarely on your shoulders. So we're here today to talk about our vision for an industry approach for increased ESG transparency. Okay? Our view is that obviously the expectations that are being placed on you are going to increase over time, and the cost and complexity of that challenge will increase as well. And today on your own, it's going to be a significant organizational strain to address that. So we'll talk through how we think there might be an alternate path. Okay. So let's see. All right, perfect. So before we kind of get into the vision, we're going to talk about kind of where we've been. And so we're characterizing kind of the period before Monday of last week as ESG 1.0. And obviously I'm alluding to obviously the SEC's proposed rule, right, which would actually require now public organizations to disclose risks associated with climate change. What's interesting about this period is a couple things. First off, this chart is actually indicating that from early 2000s to about 2019, the number of times that ESG was mentioned on a Fortune 500 earnings call was around 1% on average. Right? So the takeaway is that no one really cared about this topic. And I mean that in the best terms, right? But it wasn't kind of rising to the top of the agenda, if you will. But everything changed in 2019. And so what we think is that actually started the dawn of ESG. Social and environmental pressures really started to force investors and stakeholders to start asking for increased transparency across a variety of ESG dimensions. And so there's three kind of interesting kind of outputs, if you will, of this shift. The first is obviously institutional investors, right? The BlackRocks of the world, right? They've started to shift investment portfolios towards ESG. And we'll talk about why, But essentially, ESG very much is a leading indicator of operational performance. And they're using that to kind of indicate where they should actually place their bets. Unfortunately, that same population has indicated that the materials that they're using to allocate those bets doesn't give them the right transparency to mitigate, once again, against the investments that they're making and the risks associated with that. 93% indicated they don't feel like they have enough consistency and transparency in the information. The other interesting output is that, this has actually started to cascade down to the supply chain organization, right? Organizations today are saying, wait a minute, if I'm now getting pressured to deliver these outcomes and I'm leaning on suppliers for those outcomes, right? I may use thousands of suppliers. I need to actually think differently about how I select suppliers and then how I manage them across their life cycle. And I'm not talking just about tier ones. I'm talking about the extended network. Because once again, as the pressure rises, these organizations have to face back to their constituents, regardless if it's just a tier one. They have to know everything about their extended supply network. So these are kind of the dynamics, if you will, associated with ESG 1.0. But the big takeaway basically is the operative word voluntary, right? That organizations today have been able to kind of chart their own path within this without a leniency and flexibility. And they've been leaning on kind of the predominant framework, which is out of the UN Sustainability Development Goals framework. And it addresses kind of these aspects, if you will, right? And so, organizations today have really taken kind of a opportunistic approach, highlighting areas of strength where they're actually invested in and progressing things, but they've avoided highlighting areas that maybe haven't been prioritized or advanced. That has been kind of the predominant flavor, if you will, of ESG 1.0, right? But as mentioned, everything really changed Monday of last week, at least from our opinion. So we're talking about this inflection point as the start of a new period. We're calling it ESG 2.0 because of obviously the shift from voluntary to mandatory and the associated implications. If you read through the document, and it's sizable, right? It's over 500 pages. But the breadth, the specificity, and the complexity of what they're proposing, now if adopted, it would represent significant sweeping changes. Significant, right? And so organizations today, at least from our opinion, are not positioned to actually address kind of this initial set of requirements. And this is only from the US side. We'll talk later in our presentation about what if you're an organization that actually has international operations. That pressure is already rising, right? Much more so than the US market. Now, there's a couple interesting things about kind of what came out with the SEC. There's two things, I guess, that they were trying to harness, and these are kind of significant global shifts. One is, once again, worldwide, regulators have already made the shift from voluntary to mandatory. And they've done that largely based on the recommendations from TCFD. And so if you read through kind of the proposed rule that came out, the SEC incorporated a lot of recommendations from TCFD in their approach. So that's one. So once again, the movement is already there in the global community. The second is investors, consumers, and other stakeholders have already been clamoring for a global climate disclosure standard, once again, to drive consistency and information so that they can actually compare sustainability performance. So once again, if you read through the proposed rule, the SEC has started to attempt to mitigate against greenwashing, and they've incorporated various components that kind of address it, okay? And once again, we understand that the contours of the proposed rule may shift because we're still in the open comment period. But I think the important takeaway for this audience is that investor expectations are largely going to be based on that new enhanced requirement. And so once again, organizations are going to have to take a hard look at their current approach and realize that the era of voluntary disclosures is over. We have now pivoted very squarely towards a world that's focusing on mandatory disclosures. The other thing that we're trying to convey in this slide is kind of what it means to, once again, individuals that are in the oil and gas industry. And so there's kind of a couple salient points that we wanted to strip out for you. The first one is, I've obviously been talking a lot about kind of the SEC, but the reality is the pressure isn't just from the SEC. If you look through some of the things that came out of COP26 in Glasgow, there is a significant focus on climate change, and it's increased kind of the pressure associated with scope 3. And so now organizations must account for that within their footprint, if you will. The second was kind of an expanded scope when you think about sustainability. The conflict in Ukraine is a perfect example. Companies now must actually contemplate country risk within their extended value chain, because as investors or stakeholders are actually looking to your organization, they're actually saying, wait a minute, we have a different definition for supply chain sustainability. It's much broader than what it used to be. The third one is obviously this, and it kind of highlighted obviously in the SEC's proposed rule, but kind of this reliance, if you will, on independent attestation, verification, assurance, right? This is obviously another burden that's being placed on your organizations to ensure the veracity of the data that you're pushing back out. And then the last one is there's actually been a significant number of case filings associated with climate change. So it's highlighting kind of the legal, the reputational, financial risks associated with not addressing these implications. So all told, I mean, the ESG shift that we're seeing and this new period that we're entering is really just that predominant shift from voluntary to mandatory, and that's kind of the takeaway, but also that the expectations are broadening and they will continue to broaden. So what does that mean? We feel that, right now, all of these expectations that are being placed on your organizations is going to lead to a significant cost and agility challenge. And we're already seeing proof of that within the data. So if you look at kind of the left-hand side of the slide, what you're seeing here is that spending in global ESG data services has already surged. It's at an annual clip of 20%, and it's expected to reach over $5 billion by 2025. That's double from where we are. The reason why, once again, is organizations are now having to, and so much of that last conversation, it's all about collecting data across your extended value chain. And so what we're here today to talk about is your extended value chain. Once again, kind of your reliance on suppliers for all the outcomes that you're producing and the entirety of that problem, right? So I know we're here talking at a carbon, tracking and reporting conference. So obviously, we're going to highlight the scope 3 dimension, but you have to think about the other dimensions, right? The social and governance aspects as well. Supplier diversity, local content, conflict minerals, the list goes on. Those expectations are here and they're coming. So that is going to lead to, once again, a significant cost and organizational strain. And what we try to articulate, I understand that it's kind of difficult to read maybe from the back of the room, but on the right-hand side of the slide, these are all the things that you individually are going to have to try to tackle. You're going to have to discern who are the trading partners or suppliers that are material to your business, not just tier 1, but beyond. You're going to have to then collect, aggregate, store, transform, visualize all of that data. And then you're going to have to kind of force fit it, if you will, into different reporting standards. And that's just the table stakes, right? That's just to remain compliant with what the expectations are. This doesn't talk about impacting or kind of, delivering against any of your ESG ambitions that, once again, are dependent upon your extended value chain. So if, organizations here that have a net zero ambition, it includes scope 3, you're going to have to enable the supply base that, once again, contributes largely to your emissions footprint, right? On average, organizations across all sectors, scope 3 represents around 80% of your total emission. Within this industry, obviously, it's much higher. It's close to 90, 95%, I think, of recent numbers we've seen. So once again, significant burden, and organizations today are trying to figure out, how do I tackle this, right? So I realize that this is an awful message to start off your morning with, so I'm actually going to try to pivot quickly to kind of the positive side of the story, if you can, okay? So stay with me. I know we're close to break, if you will. So we've done, as a firm, we've done a lot of research into the benefit of focusing on purpose and the business value associated with it. And once again, this slide I think will be sent out after the conference, but basically the takeaway is that there's a distinct connection between focusing on purpose and profit, right? Significant data and research has validated that organizations that are purpose-driven can not only manage enterprise risk better, they can actually create deeper and more meaningful connections with their consumers, their stakeholders, their investors, and they can also expand into new markets. This is across all sectors, right? So in an integrated purpose strategy is not only good business sense because it delivers sustainable long-term value, but it's actually a business imperative in today's world. And so the message before I hand it over to my colleague from Riskonnect is, we're here today to talk to you about how you can unlock these benefits and address the expectations that are now sitting squarely on all of your shoulders without having to carry that cost burden entirely. Right? Once again, we're talking about an alternate path where we say, wait a minute, is there an opportunity for us to think differently about how we're collecting and sharing data relative to this problem? So once again, all of that is not sitting on my shoulders, and we're all advancing as an industry. Because absent of that, this is going to impact our cost of capital, our access to capital. We already know that institutional investors and credit rating agencies are already factoring ESG very prominently in their investment decisions. And the same is true in the insurance market. We know that that's already being factored in risk analysis in terms of insurance premiums. So this is critical that we solve for this. And so once again, I'll hand it over to Keith to talk about how we define what that may look like. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Let me grab the clicker here. I'm going to stand in the middle of the stage. So a little bit about my company, Riskonnect. Riskonnect focuses on integrated risk management, and that's kind of a mouthful, right? But when you think about it, everyone has a risk practice within their organization, and ESG is now coming to the surface. The other thing that we do is we focus on the insurable risk business. So all of your claims and claims management. So a lot of people in this room are customers of Riskonnect, and you just might not know it because it's another part of the business. We've taken ESG aspects and put that thing together into an overarching thing of integrated risk management that kind of ties all of those different points together to give you a holistic view of kind of what's going on in your organization and mitigation strategies. And the reason that we partnered with Deloitte is because we've been doing this for a long time, since 2007, in this particular space. But the majority of the risk resides in your extended value chain, not in your own operations, the things that you don't have direct control over. And when you tie that together, there's some disjointed things that are occurring in the industry. So it's been repeated in this time and time again. As it relates to ESG, there is no one size fits all, right? And there are different companies and that are at different layers of or levels of maturity, on their journey for this. So you might have companies that have, very detailed and granular emissions intensity data, and you might have companies that are just getting started that don't. So now how do you create an ecosystem, an environment where you can leverage shared knowledge and best practices to enable others and uplift the entire ecosystem? That's what we're moving towards. And this is way too busy, and it's purposeful that this is too busy because Nigel talked about, the SEC, but what's going on in Europe. And there are over 200 different mandatory regulatory reporting requirements in Europe. I think Germany has 38 and the Netherlands has 36. Even California State Senate just passed a carbon emissions scope 3 reporting, mandatory reporting for companies over $1 billion. That not even residing or living in California, but if they do more than $1 billion in annual turnover, mandatory requirements. Some of these European regulations that are rolling in go down to companies larger than 500 people with 50 million euros in turnover. So now just think about that complexity. And I mentioned this earlier over on the left side. As you are going through this, this is a very dynamic industry, the oil and gas industry, and you have complicated relationship mapping. Right? So in your different operations or product service lines or lines of business, you might have the same supplier as a tier 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? And so there's, this huge mapping exercise that needs to occur in order for the verification and the validation of the data. And so once again, it comes down to it's not really a complicated math formula, but it is a math formula. So as you are looking at what do I need to do and where do the costs lie? And so, we're seeing, okay, if scope 3 is this major portion, but it's not just scope 3, it's supplier diversity, it's water and water intensity, it's all of these other factors, that are being pulled together for mandatory reporting requirements, and I have the relationship overlap, and I have all of the different countries that I operate in, and all my different business lines, and I am gathering all of this information from this entire value chain. I mean, you are looking at throwing unnecessary resources, and it's an expensive proposition. And the reason, Europe's been doing this for quite some time, and they're more mature in what they're doing. And then the tech industry has been doing this for quite some time for a variety of reasons. Their ESG programs, I believe that Apple spends $200 million annually on ESG reporting. I mean, just think about that. That's a burden that nobody wants to incur on their own. So what if there was a better way? And that's really kind of the crux of what we want to talk about today, is that what if it was possible to take a network-based approach for data consolidation where everyone has equal access to the data? Because when we're talking about ESG data, it's pre-competitive data, right? It's information that can be shared because someone's, scope 1 is your scope 3. And so by taking all of this and putting it into kind of an industry framework, we can reduce the cost, reduce the individual effort and burden. You're no longer throwing bodies at it, but you also have verification that can be verified or assured once and leveraged in mass, drastically reducing, the things that you need to accomplish to align with your investors and other internal and external stakeholders. So, quick visualization right here. And this is just about the duplication of effort. With the amount of supplier overlap, I am asking the same information, or somebody is asking that supplier the same information multiple times. And I've spent a lot of my career in the space, and one of the things that we hear from suppliers is, I get asked the same thing like 1,000 times, but I have account managers, that are responsible for that relationship. I don't know if they're providing the latest information or if I'm providing consistent information. So it would be better if I could share this information and then direct who I want to provide access to, right? So I can make sure that my message is consistent and all of those things. The second thing that suppliers are constantly saying is we're constantly providing information to organizations and we never get any feedback back on like, okay, how do we stand within your benchmarking and other types of things? And so that feedback loop is incredibly important because the suppliers do want to improve and they want to align with your values and what you're trying to accomplish, but there's really not a good mechanism for them to do that right now. So one of the things that we've been doing together is we started this in Europe, and we actually started it in a cross-industry group of chief procurement officers, where they said we have overlap in indirect spend suppliers, we have some overlap, and I'm talking financial services companies with consumer goods companies, with oil and gas companies, with publishing and print and media and technology companies and health and life science coming together and saying, we need to bring this information together so me as a chief procurement officer can actually make informed decisions. Because if over 80% of, on average, greater than 80% of my emissions are coming from scope 3, if I can make better choices, or if I have multiple suppliers that are providing things in the same category, and the majority of my spend are going to my lesser performing ones, I can increase my spend, consolidate it, and actually have my suppliers help me reach my publicly stated goals and targets. And so what we've created is kind of this industry approach to leveraging kind of the power of large numbers, right? Following Metcalfe's law, like Facebook did when they grew, or the telephone or anything else, TCP/IP, right? Bringing all of this kind of information together into a centralized industry-based hub where then it can be operationalized way easier, much more effectively, and at a lot lower cost. And so, and part of the things that we have included, in this is lots of data resides in enterprise systems, and so we can easily pull that information in. because there's no one size fits all and everyone's at a different level of maturity, we've got over 1,000 plus conversion factors, for, I can take a raw utility bill or gallons of diesel burned or wood pellets or any of those type of things and map it with geolocation and other things to get kind of the numbers that I need for reporting purposes, but also to operationalize my practices within that in a consistent format. And then I can dashboard this and benchmark it and compare it and provide that feedback loop back so I can leverage some engagement capabilities and e-learning and other things to uplift the ecosystem. But not only can we do it at the supplier level, down to the individual product level, right? So starting with the raw material and the transport and then the processing and multiple tiers through the supply chain. So really complicated data mapping to get down to the level of granularity that we're seeing, investors and others expect. And Nigel mentioned the insurance aspect because, that's the one thing that nobody can get away from. But that's really important because, if anybody's run financial models or other things, unknown risk is really expensive to price, which therefore makes it really expensive. And so even if you have not great data, but you are transparent that you don't have great data, you get the benefit of the doubt because, kind of Peter Drucker, what gets measured can be managed sort of thing. So by leveraging kind of this approach, we can do some really amazing things in a much more efficient manner. And this is just kind of what, kind of phase one of a new paradigm that we've put together that kind of focuses on, we're talking about supplier sustainability here, but then also augmenting that with the data verification and assurance, risk illumination, multiple tiers deep, human rights audits or inspections, all tied down. And there's some kind of screenshots of the solution at the bottom that kind of go into, kind of what it looks like in some of those other functional areas. And that's really what we want to kind of begin discussing going forward, is a way to make this a whole lot easier, a whole lot faster, and a whole lot less expensive with a higher quality of data and results. So I'm going to stop right there. And
I think we could have time for one question. One up there. How much of both of your resources get devoted to energy, more specific oil and gas? Guess I am curious where the industry fits in comparison with other industries based on y'all's experience.
You want to take the first part and I'll take the second?
We can start off.
Yeah. So as far as industries, I'm going to speak for Riskonnect because I work across a bunch of different industries, including financial institutions, helping them manage their portfolio of investments and real estate assets, and insurers, and on all of these others. As an industry, oil and gas is on the lower end of the maturity curve. I mentioned tech previously because tech was one of the ones that was kind of forced into getting into ESG through lack of diversity and inclusion. And part of the reason is because it is very consumer focused, and the millennial and the Gen Z, populations as consumers deeply care about ESG. Retail and consumer goods was kind of the next one. And so those are the two kind of leading sectors, which also means that there's about 6 years worth of really solid best practices that can be leveraged here. Because it's not going away, and there's, the ship has kind of sailed, and there's really nothing that is going to kind of turn the tide because the world is kind of grouped around that. Now, you want to talk about?
Yeah, just maybe one point. Just trying to read through the question, think through a different dynamic of where it may be coming from. But one thing that kind of we bring to the discussion, if you will, is kind of a deep background actually within industry. For example, my background is at Hess, and prior to that was at Shell. Always in the upstream space, but we understand kind of the flight of capital that has occurred, and we understand the criticality of capital for this industry. And so, we're looking at this at a lens to say, what can we do to bring back that market? What can we do to provide the transparency in a different way? Yet once again, do it in a way that doesn't place a significant burden on your shoulders. So we have very much a heightened sense of urgency to kind of focus on this and tackle this for the industry.
So my mistake. I thought we were stopping at 50. We've got a couple minutes left. So we got another question. Perfect timing. I don't know who asked that, but this anonymous, your timing was brilliant.
Yeah.
Is there a specific standard for scope 3 emissions that the hub requires suppliers to report based on? It's a really great question.
It is a fantastic question. And I'll give you a little background into how we built the tool. Back when I started focusing on this to create this was in early 2019, as the industry shift from kind of sustainability and corporate social responsibility into kind of what's known as ESG today. There are over 220 non-financial reporting frameworks out there. And so I and my team looked at all of those and said, okay, what are the commonalities associated with the frameworks? What are, kind of the different constituents groups looking at? And so we landed on GRI, TCFD, SASB, WDI, which is Workforce Disclosure Initiative, UNPRI, and then we looked at what the investors are looking at. So if I'm BlackRock, I'm signed up to Climate Action 100, and there are over 70 institutional investment collaborations or coalitions that have over $1 trillion of AUM in them, right? So all of your strategic investors have their own reporting requirements. So we looked at all of that and we created a framework, and we started with GRI. And the reason, because there was significant overlap between GRI and SASB and TCFD. And then where some frameworks went further than others, we kind of extended into that. So what that allows us to do is collect data once and apply it to TCFD, SASB, GRI, et cetera, once again, reducing the burden, because then I can model my dashboards and reporting and push a button and export to the TCFD format or a CDP format or a SASB format. So great question.
Maybe one just add on to that. I mean, I think that was a tremendous answer. But we also realize that a lot of your suppliers are not that sophisticated, right? So now they're getting all these kind of questionnaires that are coming at them, sometimes in myriad different formats. And so, the solution is very much focused on supplier enablement, right? How can we actually help your suppliers to kind of align with the objectives that you're setting? Because we recognize that obviously, a lot of them are not that sophisticated and they need help, yet they don't have the capital to invest in the capabilities. And so that is a critical part of this solution as well.
Thank you, Keith and Nigel.